Today, I want to talk to you about fishing tidal waters and how I'm preparing for the next BPT event on the James River. Early in my career, I went and fished a few tidal fisheries, and I got to say they were super intimidating. Luckily, I've spent a lot of time saltwater fishing, and I've learned to appreciate tidal fisheries. They're very humbling, whether it's saltwater or freshwater, and it's one of those things that it's just another variable that you have to put into the equation when it comes to having a successful day on the water. And I look back early in my career. One of them that comes to mind is I think it was 1996. I fished a tournament on the James River. So needless to say, that was a few years ago. Definitely wasn't a lot of media out there for it, or stuff for me to pull up social media wise. Another one that comes to mind was the Potomac River. We fished the Hudson River in New York. And then, we fished a lot of them all over throughout the East Coast, and then even down in Louisiana, and then even out in California. Tidal waters are interesting, regardless of where it is, whether it's a tidal river or not. I tend to go and I make notes on my paper maps, and the little bit of information that I have, it's been so long that I fished there, my information is actually on these maps. So I believe I fished an open event here, a bass or top 100 event back in '96. And then I think I maybe fished one WCF event here back maybe in the early 2000s. So don't have a lot of experience there. So I'm going to rely a lot on just trying to do my homework and knowing what I've learned over 30 years and my knowledge with tidal fisheries of how do I want to approach this one. So, I like to put my hands on the paper maps and all that, but now we have our apps. I've got my Garmin electronics with amazing mapping. And, even now with my Garmin's, I can just scroll up, push a button, and it's going to tell me the tides. But the tides are so important here. So, it's one of these deals where I might, if I had a lot of knowledge here, I might say this is my favorite part of the James River to fish. But I may look and go, wow, that area is going to have terrible tides during our event. The start of our day might be the bottoming out of low tide and then an incoming tide all day long, or we're hitting the top of an incoming tide and then a slack tide, and then the start of a falling tide. So when it comes to tides typically on a normal day, you're going to have 2 incoming tides and 2 outgoing tides. Obviously that varies based on your moon phases and all that. Your tides are actually influenced by the rotation of the earth and your moon phases. But it's one of those things that if you're going to a tidal fishery and where there's quite a bit of tidal influence, you really have to put that into consideration. If I remember right, the James River is about 1.5 to 2.5 foot tide variance, depending on where you're at on this. And what that also means is I believe where we take off up at Osborne Landing up towards Richmond down to our off limits area, which is down in the Sound somewhere. It's like a 40-mile difference. So in that 40-mile difference, the tide may do a lot more out in the Sound versus it may do a lot less way up the James River, where it's more influenced then by all the incoming water from the James River. That all depends on the rain that they have as well. Kind of like what the Chowan River was. The Chowan River wasn't influenced so much by the ocean and the tides there because it had so much fresh water coming in. So you got to put all those variables into consideration when you're planning for a tidal fishery. So yes, I know I am not an expert on tidal fisheries. I'm a guy from Kansas. We grew up fishing lakes, but however, on that, I've grown up doing a lot of saltwater fishing. And how did I learn to saltwater fish? It was by spending a lot of time in the water and a lot of humbling fishing trips with, along the way, a few very rewarding fishing trips. And heck, I remember my dad and I were down in Florida one year fishing, and we would rent a boat, and we're fishing this spot out in the bay that we'd found. And we're sitting out there, and you really start to question your sanity of what are we doing out here? There's no fish here. They're not biting. But then when the window opened up and the tide got right, it was amazing. And I think you're going to see that in our event next week, where you're going to see, where a lot of our events, it's pretty consistent. I think you're going to see where guys go into big flurries here, where they catch a lot of fish, a lot of numbers in a small period of time. And then they may go dead for, the catches for them might go dead for a while. And what that's going to be is that's going to be the tide being such a factor in this event. So if you're going to a tidal fishery, you have to have that in the back of your mind of, you need to try to plan your practice and even your tournament or your successful times based around certain times. For me, what I've found and what I like to try to fish around is the lower end of a falling tide. And what I found, what that means is when you have an incoming tide, is it's rising water. So it's no different in a lake. When you have rising water, typically what it does is it scatters the fish out. It gets them, sometimes it puts them into places where you can't even get to them because they get so shallow. However, then you get to high tide and it's the most water possible. It's high. The fish are very scattered out. And a lot of times, even the fish know that's not their best time to feed. The fish know that a falling tide is coming for them, meaning the food is going to be coming towards them. And I believe, or at least in my opinion, the best tide is a falling tide. And as you get more towards the lower end of a falling tide, what it does is it just makes your body of water that you're fishing, it makes it smaller, makes it where the fish are more concentrated, the bait's more concentrated, and it seems like it's easier to pinpoint those fish. Now, when I go to the James River, my ultimate goal is to find an area that has a tremendous amount of fish in it, get in there and commit to it and make the most out of it, whether, try to have an area like that where I feel like it's got the winning potential. But what I want to do is I want to go in there and I may fish it on the incoming tide just because I know there's a lot of fish there and grind my way through it. And you may have to mix up some certain techniques to do more searching to find a few of those fish to grind through it. But then I want to be at that spot during that optimal time, which is going to be some time during that falling tide. So that's what I found is the best strategy for me over the years, is to find an area, grind my way through the tough times, but be there so I can capitalize when that tide gets exactly right. And then the big key there is like I said, capitalize, make sure you're throwing the best baits in the best areas where you feel like you can catch the most and the biggest fish. So knowing your tides is the big key, and knowing what the tides are going to be doing where you're fishing. So the easiest thing to do is I can pull it up on my Garmin's. I can scroll through and it will have certain areas, or will actually, if I'm on the body of water on a certain place, I can click nearest tidal spot where they actually a tidal gauge, and it will tell me, it's 5 miles away or whatever it is. I also have, my Navionics app, that will show me tide charts, but now you can Google it and there's 10,000 different ways to see where the tide is. Now, the important thing is knowing where the tidal gauge is in relation to where you're at. So, another big thing with my Garmin's is I can go to my units and do it that way, but I can also go through my phone with my active captain. I can find the tides that way, or the Navionics app is a great way to see your tides as well. But the big key is remembering you want to see the tidal gauge closest to where you're actually planning on fishing, because as you move up and down the river, that tide is going to be different based on the hours of the day. So I believe it's every 7 miles is an hour difference. But here's another thing to remember on that too, is your wind. Depending on how a body of water lays, a really strong north wind or south wind or west wind can either push water out of an area, causing the tide to drop a lot more, or it can push a lot of water in and causing the tides to be a lot higher or whatever. So I love my paper maps and looking at my paper maps, but now with technology, it's so much easier with these phones. But I can pull up, I've got my Navionics app here. And so what's cool is I can pull up on my app here. Here's the Chickahominy River. I can scroll to right there. So this is Wright Island right island landing, and I can click on it, and it will tell me the tide. It says your time is 1 hour behind. That's because I think we're in Central Time right now. So literally at 11:44 was high tide at this spot. So if you were up here in Uncle's Neck Creek, you're pretty darn close to there. So you know your high tide was at 11:44, and until 6 p.m. you're going to have a good falling tide. But at 6 p.m. you're going to hit low tide, and probably not a time you want to be there. But then from 6 p.m. until just a little after midnight, you're going to have a good incoming tide for that area. So if you have certain areas that you want to fish under certain tides, you can kind of gauge of when to be there. I mean, so you can scroll around on here, and we'll find a different tidal location. So here's one right here, these little arrows. Jamestown, Virginia, I can click on it. So while we were just at high tide up there in the Chickahominy, we are actually, high tide here was at 9:30 a.m. and we are 2/3 of the way through a falling tide. So we're closer to a low tide. So if you wanted to fish closer to a low tide, you run down to this area and these are the conditions you're going to have. So it's really, really a big deal. And you can actually see over here to the side the difference of how this works. So basically there's low tide, and then it shows it at high tide. It is a little over a 2-foot difference in your tide in that particular area. So the resources that are out there now make tidal fishing a lot easier, and I'm probably a little easier to plan your day out there on the water. But like I said, the biggest key to getting out there on tidal waters is to fish them, kind of see how a day plays out in particular areas, knowing what things look like. And I think the neat thing that I like about tidal fisheries is a lot of times, if you can do it right, you can pattern them. And what I mean by that is, if you're catching fish on, let's say, laydowns on an hour before low tide, what you can do then a lot of times is you can look on your map and go, here's where the good low tide is going to be here. But as the day progresses, I can just run up this river and I'm going to be in the same tide in those same areas. And then I can go run laydowns or docks and be in that same tidal conditions, fish those same patterns under those same situations. So if you've never fished a tidal water, get out there and try it, because it's a fun thing to do. It's another challenge in the sport of fishing, and it can be very rewarding.